Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 23rd of January 2023. 230123 is the week. And I am joined as ever by my co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman. And today I'm not going to make a quip about how we are, who we are, where we are, what we're doing, because today's topic it's a sobering one. We're going to be talking today on the 27th of January about Holocaust remembrance and the international efforts to ensure that remembrance continues, and also as well how that relates to the work of archaeology and archaeologists. Now, in this conversation, I am acting as Yao, the viewer, as it were, because Andy's going to take us both, or us all, indeed. Hopefully, there's more than one viewer on a bit of an educational tour of some of these efforts and ideas. So, where are we going to start, Andy?
We're going to start with, I think, the premise that Holocaust memorialization, Holocaust research, is obviously one of the most sensitive areas of historical and archaeological work. It's probably also one of the lesser known, but it also has direct relevance to things that are going on in the world today.
Yeah.
For example, the investigation of war crimes and crimes against humanity, with the prospect of hopefully eventually bringing perpetrators in front of the International Criminal Court in The Hague or under local jurisdictions.
Mm-hmm.
So this is really serious and important stuff. And I thought on Holocaust Memorial Day 2023, it might be interesting, helpful, important actually, to take an overview really of where the archaeology of the Holocaust comes from, kind of work that's been going on and the sensitivities around it.
Mm-hmm.
And just as our contribution to remembering one of the greatest, the most appalling crimes against humanity ever committed.
Yeah.
So that's the starting point.
Just before we start, though, can I just say we will be keeping the comment section to this video open. However, in the past, when we've touched on some of these topics, we've had, shall we say, unwelcome contributions. If those contributions turn up, I'll simply be deleting them. I won't be debating you. I won't be clicking on your links. They'll be gone. So let's just keep the conversation civil and pertinent today. Okay.
I think that's really important. I mean, the key to this is we are talking about crimes against humanity.
Yeah.
And we're all humans.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the most important thing to remember in this. I'm starting from the point of view of, as many people who've Watching Brief will know, my particular archaeological specialism is what's called the archaeology of modern conflict, which is primarily the conflicts of the 20th century. And of course, taking place in the European World War between 1939 and 1945, the Holocaust falls squarely within that archaeological remit. And of course, the other thing about the archaeology of modern conflict is it deals with everybody who is exposed to war and the effects of war, not just militaries.
Yes.
So it's not battlefield archaeology.
No.
It's the archaeology of what happens to people in situations of conflict. So that's where I'm coming from.
Would that be, because I've used this phrase recently with regards to Ukraine and history and heritage in Ukraine, but would this be what's known as total war? So the idea that civilians are fair game in a conflict, and civilian space.
Well, that is something of a misnomer, in fact, because one of the stories, and in fact one of the things that archaeologists and historians and lawyers work with when you're trying to analyze the background to these situations, whether they're taking place currently in Ukraine or 80 years ago in Europe, it is the attempts of the international community to regulate war, which, people argue, it began with the early Christian theologians who argued in favor of a just war, for example. That you couldn't just wage war for its own sake, but it had to have it had to be in support of a greater good, if you like.
Yeah.
When you get down into the 19th and 20th century, you have a series of international conventions that are negotiated famously at Geneva and at The Hague, which attempt to, they actually do impose what are called the laws of war. So, for example, arguably to wage war on civilians just because they're civilians is a war crime, whereas to wage war on a industrial infrastructure where civilians happen to be working, if that infrastructure is directly serving the war aims of your opponent, is not necessarily a war crime. You know, even before we get into what are classed as deliberate crimes against humanity, the deliberate mass murder of civilians for no reason other than they are civilians of a particular racial, ethnic, or religious identity. There are already controversies, so it's an area which has been developing throughout the 20th and into the 21st century.
I suppose it's just to sort of cap that off a little bit. I suppose if there are laws of war, law courts are already places where two parties at least are very adversarial. If you're trying to put jurisdictions over conflict where lots of people are dying and there's lots of emotion and political necessities involved, then it's going to get complicated and knotty.
Yeah. Now, you can bring all these things together in one of the earliest examples that I've found of archaeological research relating to the Holocaust, which was actually now just on 30 years ago. Up until then, most presentations of information about the Holocaust have been based on the newsreel films that were taken of the camps as they were liberated in 1945. There's famous film, for example, of Auschwitz-Birkenau and some of the surviving prisoners from Auschwitz-Birkenau, taken shortly after the Soviet army overran the camp and liberated it. There's also, again, famously in the UK, the film of the camp at Bergen-Belsen. Again, within hours of the liberation, some of the first material was shot by army photographers and army cinematographers. And the people will be familiar perhaps with the images of bodies being literally bulldozed into mass graves, because that was the only way to try and maintain the health of the surviving prisoners in the camp where disease was absolutely rife. It's the kind of images that once seen, never forgotten. My partner's late mother actually described being in a cinema in the late spring, early summer of 1945, when that material was released on a newsreel, and remembers her father actually covering her eyes when that material came on screen. So that material, plus the documents that were captured, and particularly documents that were used at the Nuremberg trials, the war crimes trials of the Nazi elite, beginning in 1946, and also the testimony of survivors, was the basis for, if you like, public knowledge of what had happened to principally Jewish people, but also Roma, homosexuals, other groups that the Nazis targeted for oppression and in the end murder. Archaeology didn't figure; it wasn't necessary. It would appear.
And sorry, would that be because just to address something there? Is that because what they came across was so self-evident, or is it because it was deemed to be too sensitive to, sending people in to study effectively the dead in that instance might not have been seen as ethically sound? Is that part of it?
Well, what's happening, I think, a couple of things. And again, as I say, I'm talking here as a general conflict archaeologist. I'm not a Holocaust specialist.
No, no.
And there may well be other views out there. And there's a lot of material out there, actually. So, we've posted some key links, what we think are key links. But also there's other material out there. Go and look at it and find out about it. Because I think everybody should be interested in this. This is a really important subject. In terms of physical interventions, after the war, you get the camps being preserved as what is sometimes termed as dark heritage. Things that are part of our heritage, a part of a nation's heritage, part of our collective human heritage, which, although they deal with the darkest and grimmest of subjects, they need to be kept for sometimes political, primarily humanitarian reasons, to remind us of what can go wrong in societies. So, for example, if you go to Munich, just outside Munich is the preserved, the first, in fact, significant concentration camp of Dachau, which began as basically a political camp soon after the Nazis came to power. The Polish government has famously preserved and even rebuilt, in fact, but certainly preserved much of Auschwitz-Birkenau. The most famous death camp of all, although in fact it's much more complicated than just being a death camp. And this is where Holocaust studies become really important, because the Holocaust wasn't one event. It wasn't trainloads of people being taken from their homes to that siding Auschwitz-Birkenau, because even there it wasn't a one-way ticket to death. Some of those prisoners survived. They were selected at the time, and they survived the horrific conditions within the camp to be either liberated by the Russians in 1945 on 27th of January, or they were transferred to other camps towards the end of the war, after the extermination campaign ended in the autumn of 1944. So, late autumn of 1944. So, you have to be careful. And in fact, one of the things we'll talk about in a minute is the recognition that before the camps even opened, there was what is now an event, which is what is now called the Holocaust by bullet, very often, which was the mass murder by shooting of Jewish communities. And political, and to a certain extent also political opponents of the Nazis, but primarily Jewish communities. And that began in Poland and in the Baltics, and in Western Russia, in 1941, with in the follow-up to Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia. Okay. So you have a whole series of events that culminate. They culminate in places, in that icon, Auschwitz. With the train siding running under that gate, the infamous motto over the gates, Arbeit macht frei, labor makes you free, work makes you free, which was over the gates of many of the camps. But we're dealing with a much more complex event, and the mechanics of that event, how it came about, who did things, is still being discovered, is still being worked on. And again, I'll come back to that in a minute. What the archaeology of the Holocaust doesn't appear to have sort of grown up particularly consciously until relatively recently. The first instance I can find of an archaeological intervention in the Holocaust studies, and I say someone may correct me and come up with another, but in 1991, an Australian archaeologist called Richard Wright undertook excavations of mass graves containing Jewish victims in the Ukraine. And the reason he was doing that in Ukraine was there was a criminal investigation in South Australia by the Adelaide Special Investigation Unit. Now, that was a special unit of the Australian police, effectively, who were investigating the case of three men who had gone to live in Australia after the war and had been granted citizenship
Mm-hmm.
But they were then accused of taking part in the mass murder of Jewish people at a place called Saniki in 1942. What Wright did, working on behalf of the Australian government and the South Australian government, within a Ukraine that was just becoming free of the Soviet Union, was that he was able to identify a mass grave, estimated that there were around 550 victims. But they couldn't dig any further without significantly disturbing the remains. Now, one of the issues involved in the archaeology of the Holocaust is that what's called the Halacha law, an element of Jewish religious law, forbids the disturbance of the dead under any circumstances. So you're dealing with a very sensitive issue. Now, subsequently, sites of mass graves haven't been excavated because Halacha has been, or Halasha, and again, I might forgive me if my pronunciation's wrong, has been invoked. That it's seen as inappropriate and profane even to disturb the resting places of the dead. In the case of Wright's excavation, it's not entirely clear, but that prohibition may have been overridden by the fact that they were actually looking for forensic evidence in a potential criminal case.
Right. Yeah.
And subsequently, again, there was another excavation undertaken by Wright at a place called Ustanovka, also in Ukraine, where a further 170 people were their remains were identified and partially exhumed. So that's the first precedent I can find that your archaeologists are investigating the sites of criminal actions as part of a criminal investigation, not as research archaeology.
No.
But forensic archaeological methods are being used. And in fact, Wright himself went on to work in former Yugoslavia, and I'll come back to that later. The next significant element of research on the camps took place in Poland. In the late 1990s, it was becoming clear that 3 camps in particular, which had been set up under what was called Operation Reinhard, as a sick tribute to Reinhard Heydrich, who was the head of the SS, who was behind the final solution and who had been assassinated by Czech members of the Special Operations Executive. 3 camps were set up for Operation Reinhard at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka in Poland. Set up by the Nazis, commanded by SS officers. And they were set up purely as extermination centres. They weren't like Auschwitz, where you had factories owned, for example, by companies like IG Farben, where the prisoners provided the workforce. They were purely there to murder principally Jews from Western Europe, including from Holland and Germany, Berlin included, where a relatively small force of SS and auxiliaries worked with a small workforce of impressed prisoners to process each transport as it came through, to see people murdered and the corpses disposed of. Now, 2 of those camps, Sobibor and Treblinka, are famous as well as being the scene of prisoner uprisings. People watching this might have seen there have been at least 2 versions of the uprising at Sobibor in October 1943, when hundreds of prisoners tried to break out across the wire and the minefields around the camp, and a number of the uprising was actually led by a Russian Jewish army officer. So those camps had left relatively, well, almost no survivors. So whereas at places like Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz, you had quite extensive survivor testimony, as historians were pointing out, that survivor testimony wasn't the norm. The norm was people going into that system were murdered. They died. They were never able to pass on their experience.
No.
So the only way to mark what happened at places like Belzec and Sobibor and Treblinka was through the documents of the perpetrators and the experiences of the perpetrators as recorded, for example, at war crimes trials. But the only physical remains were in the camps themselves, and the camps were destroyed by the Nazis in an attempt to cover their tracks before the war ended, before the sites were overrun by the Soviet army.
Yeah. Yeah.
So basically, you've got the fences, the barracks, the offices, the gas chambers are there is an attempt to remove them from the site, and the sites were, for example, planted with trees, to try and cover what was going on. So, in the late 1990s, about 8 years after Wright was working in Ukraine, an archaeologist called Andrei Kola was brought in to look at Belzec, because as part of the plans to memorialize the Holocaust, they were planning a memorial at Belzec. And that required a survey of the site and things like drilling of cores. Now, that was highly controversial, because although the work pinpointed the site of mass graves and could suggest the number of people who'd been murdered there and were contained within those mass graves, it did appear to be a violation of the Halacha law, in that it was disturbing the dead. When similar work took place at Sobibor around the year 2000, around the turn of the millennium, there was a further discussion, and in fact, since then, the work at the camps has become much less invasive. It's been much more strictly controlled. Now, what people in the West, certainly in the English-speaking world, are probably most familiar with in terms of major projects are at another one of the Operation Reinhard camps, Treblinka, where since 2010, a British archaeologist called Caroline Sturdy-Coles, who's professor of archaeology of conflict and the Holocaust at Staffordshire University, led a project that was done with the permission of the chief rabbi of Poland and the curator of the Treblinka Museum, and was designed to provide us a non-invasive survey to try and find out just what was going on where at the camp. Again, Treblinka was one of the places, but there were very, very few survivors. The point about that, though, it wasn't part of the development of a memorial, existing or new. It was actually a full-on, if you like, landscape survey of the site, but within very strict ethical and religious considerations. There already was a major memorial at the site, and again, people might be familiar with the photographs. It's thousands of jagged stones laid out in the sort of carpet at what was the sort of center of the camp, and at the same time, the Holocaust Research Memorial Center at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem had also been undertaking an archaeological study headed up by an archaeologist called Isaac Gilead at Sobibor. And again, because Sobibor had been destroyed by the Nazis, the plans were somewhat speculative. They were based on survivors and recollections from both sides. What happened, interestingly, in the case of Sobibor was that although the site of some of the camp's fences were identified, and hundreds of artifacts, many of which probably belonged to the people who were murdered there, were found. It led in 2015 to plans for the memorial to being suspended, because it was decided that there was virtually no chance of building a memorial at the site which didn't run the risk of disturbing the remains of the murdered.
Yeah, or having access, for example, to the site that didn't require. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, another thing that's been going on, stepping back even earlier than the Operation Reinhard sites, is work that's been going on in the Baltic states and in Poland again, and in Belarus and others, and Ukraine, investigating the Holocaust by bullet. The first stages of the Holocaust, with the Einsatzgruppen following up the German army groups in the invasion of Russia, Operation Barbarossa in 1941. So it was sort of planned and unplanned. One of the things that, because there was no infrastructure put in place for this, there are no camps. There's not even a camp that's been destroyed.
No.
You had people in local communities who were rounded up, sometimes put into ghettos for a period, but sometimes taken straight out into the woods and shot, or down to the sand dunes and shot.
And so, just so I can try and understand this, was this spontaneous action amongst certain groups of troops? Was this trying to emulate what they had attempted to do initially in Germany with ghettoization, and then moving people on? What you say it was planned and unplanned, but how unplanned was it in that sense?
It was planned in that there was an aim to murder Jews and communists,
right?
Particularly Jews. That was part of Nazi ideology. It was part of the SS's ideology. It was planned through groups called Einsatzgruppen, who were attached to each of the German army groups that were invading Russia as part of Barbarossa. And they were units that were specifically there to their primary function was to round up and murder Jewish people.
Right.
And that was planned. That by this time the decision had been made at the Wannsee conference to which was chaired by Reinhard Heydrich. It also involved an SS administrator called Adolf Eichmann. The name might be familiar to some people. And it basically brought together all the elements of the Nazi government to say, to affect a final solution. It's where, for example, the definition in the minutes, there are the definition of full Jews, quarter Jew, half Jews, quarter Jews, and so on, and where each of them fits into the particular plan. So, knowing they're going into Eastern Europe and Western Russia, where there are millions of Jewish people living, the plan is, the plan is there to remove those populations. But how it actually happens, there's no plan at the Wannsee conference to open a camp capable of murdering over 1 million people like Auschwitz-Birkenau.
No.
So it's this, in a sense, it's this huge, disgusting snowball that starts with propaganda and othering in the 1930s and goes through Kristallnacht and try to make the conditions so appalling that people leave of their own accord, having left all their money and property behind, and handed over their art collections, etc., etc., etc. When that effectively is stopped by the advent of the war, and borders are effectively sealed and people can't get out anymore, even if they can get an American visa. I mean, the recent research, for example, was that Otto Frank was trying to obtain American visas until relatively late on, until Holland was overrun, and then they were trapped. The Frank family was trapped in Holland. Behind as part of the Nazi Empire. So the situation was, so this huge disgusting snowball, which began with the idea of mass shootings and ended up with the mass murder in the gas chambers, the technological solution, if you like, which was facilitated by a German industry, trained architects and so on. None of that was in position when Barbarossa started and the Einsatzgruppen started.
Yeah, but I mean, but as you say, I mean, if various aspects of the government at the time were aware of this aspiration, I guess lots of people started to apply themselves to this particular effort.
That's right, and in fact, just this week, the BBC's contribution to the Holocaust Memorial Day is a documentary called "How the Holocaust Began." It was fronted by James Bulgin, who's a historian who works at the Imperial War Museum and was one of the creators of their new Holocaust galleries. What this documentary explored was work that's going on in Eastern Europe into those first months of the Holocaust in the Baltic states and in Poland and Belarus and so on, and the work that's being done to again give back the humanity and the location of the remains of the people who were murdered. And that is being done because again there's very little in terms of physical remains. There are very, very few survivors and survivor testimonies. So what the people who are researching this are doing is using basic archaeological research techniques. They're going back to documents. They're going back to air photographs and photographs that were taken, and in a few cases, for example, members of the Einsatzgruppen SS or other members of German armed forces or other people took photographs of the events as they were going on. Some were even filmed on cinefilm, silent cinefilm, for various reasons. And again, some people might be familiar with some of that material turns up quite often in Holocaust documentaries. So you've got those primary sources, if you like, but people are now applying archaeological techniques, principally the analysis of air photographs, which enables you to look for the disturbances in the ground. It enables you to look at, for example, a village, a Luftwaffe air photograph in, say, the first part of 1941, which shows a village complete, and then one that's taken later on, which shows some of the houses in that village have been destroyed or whatever, and you can make a pretty reasonable assumption that that's where the Jewish community in that village was living. But also things like the remains of backfilled trenches, which might be the sites of mass graves and so on. And they're using non-intrusive methods, basically different geophysical techniques to identify these sites. And the documentary interviewed Dr. Harry Joel of the University of Wisconsin, who's been doing a lot of this work and trying to map these sites and the sites of the mass graves so they can be protected and memorialized respectfully without being investigated intrusively. But the other thing that Bulgin's documentary looked at as well was again the things that were going on for example, sites of the where experimentation, shall we say, in mass murder was being undertaken by certain SS units to try and find a, quote, more efficient way of murdering large numbers of people, which didn't have a debilitating psychological effect on the people doing the murdering, which being up close and personal with a rifle or a pistol or even a machine gun did. So it's areas really of the history of the Holocaust which aren't currently as well known as they should be, because they've been, understandably, because it's internationally emblematic, but it's been overtaken by the images of Bergen-Belsen and that railway siding at Auschwitz-Birkenau.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I mean, this is because obviously it seems like every other week you have someone on social media or someone in a particular position in someone's government somewhere using genocidal and specifically Holocaust language to describe their particular current woes. And it's this sort of explanation just helps to underline why we probably shouldn't be using that word to describe how you feel about, for example, a vaccination program. Yeah. The other thing that comes to mind as well is that the other day we had our current Home Secretary, because it's interesting because you talked about how initially there was this effort to make life untenable for people, so they just leave of their own accord. You know, Britain has done things like that very recently. There's the so-called hostile environment to try and encourage people to go back home, in inverted commas. What's interesting, though, is that, again, it's not appropriate to compare that to the Holocaust because it hasn't gone down that trackway. And so we can and should learn lessons. And the reason why I mention that is that our current Home Secretary, because this was done by her predecessor times 3 or something, initially was set in motion. She was recently confronted by someone who was a child who had survived, was it Auschwitz? It was one of the camps I'd heard of, certainly, yeah.
Yes.
She confronted her at a town hall event and said, why are you using language like invaders, hordes, yeah, that kind of thing, language which is very emotive and invokes rats and cockroaches and inhumane language to describe people who are moving. And unfortunately, our Home Secretary doubled down on it. She said, "Oh, actually, I think I'm entirely entitled to talk about it the way I want to." Yeah. So, and again, it's I can see why it's tempting for some people to rush to use Holocaust language to talk about that, even. But what we have there is a warning from someone who experienced it, saying this stuff is dangerous. Even she didn't say this is like a Holocaust. What she's saying is, don't do this. And yeah, that was just a thought that just came to mind. I mean, some of the stuff you described there is horrendous. I suppose. I mean, a question I have for you. You talk about how up close personal killing was mentally debilitating for soldiers, and also how towards the end of the war you had Nazis actively destroying camps in order to hide evidence. So all of this shows you that they knew it was psychologically immoral and that it was definitely legally wrong. But how does this affect the people who study this stuff? Because, for example, not that long ago we were talking to a Polish friend and colleague of yours who you met at uni, and she's certainly affected still, as it were, by the history of the Second World War. She didn't live through it, but studying this stuff certainly, I think, has affected her passion for the study. Do you think that people have to go into studying this with a level head? I mean, is this exactly why tabloid newspapers don't know what they're talking about when they say that archaeologists shouldn't need, warnings when it comes to talking about mass graves, etc.?
That's absolutely right. Not that many years ago, the Daily Mail did a hit job on the conflict archaeology course at University College London Institute of Archaeology, and the archaeologist who was leading the course. And it was wimpy archaeologists, trigger warnings, all the usual right-wing tropes. In fact, what that course was doing was acting as a primer for people who might go on, for example, to study forensic archaeology and the investigation of war crimes, and it covered material which could cause upset in anybody with a soul.
Yeah.
But particularly of concern was the fact that people taking part in that course included, for example, former service personnel and others who might find some of that material triggering. People with, people who suffer from PTSD can be triggered by many things. Can be, I have a colleague who has served in the military who finds the period around November the 5th, with all the explosions in the sky and so on, quite difficult to deal with sometimes. Even if only for a moment. Once this stuff is in somebody's head, you can't get rid of it very easily, and you have to, it's just out of respect for people. You have to treat it sensitively. For the people doing it, I mean, I've only been involved in this kind of work at a very low level in places like the Western Front in France. But I remember the first time I went onto a site in Flanders, I was with a very experienced colleague. And one of the first things we saw when we stepped down into the trench was a disarticulated human femur that had been smashed in half. And it only takes, it takes a moment when you think, have I just seen what I've just seen? Yes, I have seen what I've just seen. And I remember my colleague saying to me, are you okay? I said, yeah, I'm fine. He said, if you want to talk about it anytime, just do. And that people look after each other's backs. The people and the people, and again, it was what was so reprehensible about the way that the production company treated the cast of Nazi war diggers, aka battlefield recovery, because they were put into the place of they were involved in an excavation at a Polish site of a war crime from the end of the war, which involved the murder of civilians, possibly German civilians by Poles or Russians. Really, one of the really dark periods of at the end of the war where people,
recriminations, etc. Yeah.
Recriminations were being exacted on certain populations. And they were put into a situation where they were uncovering one of the people who'd been murdered on that occasion was a young child. And one of the people who's put into that situation also had a young child. And and yet there was no support. I know for a fact, that there was no support. There was no briefing. There was none of the risk assessments for mental health and so on that you would have in a professional situation. The production company turned down the chance for all that advice.
So that's so there's that, but also so I'm aware that either earlier today or yesterday, depending on when this is edited and released, we're going to be releasing a preview 5 minutes or so for an upcoming chat that we had about Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse.
Yeah.
And
there are a lot more laughs in that, folks.
Yeah, there are a lot more laughs. But also, what I think what's really important here is, so the crossover being a TV production crew meandering into an archaeological site. But when it comes to for example, Hancock, that's probably the least offensive, least dangerous way in which archaeology is taken lightly, and people are mucking about with other people's lives and the evidence of their lives to create a narrative that they can sell. And so I think this, while that sample, that preview will hopefully give you a sense of the of the humour and the levity that we approach that conversation with. I'm just reminded of the fact that actually this is another reason why we need to take seriously how people talk about the physical evidence of the past, because it's not that, before you know it, you're a TV crew filming on the site of a potential war crime. It's not. You can start off with what seems to be a relatively innocuous issue of access to a sacred native space, and then before you know it, you're knee deep in a truly controversial place. Obviously, though, the subject of today's video has been Holocaust remembrance, and it happens to have coincided with the day when we normally release our watching brief. I suppose, just finally, is there anything that you would say to people who have sort of who have questions, who have a curiosity about these knotty issues that surround the study of such tragedy? Because we can be respectful, we can be sober, we can be calm in our approach, but presumably also as well, we and so many other people and organisations we'll be linking to below have to also be approachable. Do you have any thoughts on that?
What I would say is that, as I said, I think at the beginning, and I'll also reiterate now, I think this is one of the most important areas for archaeology, where archaeology comes right up against our, hopefully, common humanity, our common sense of justice, our engagement with societies and with the questions that society throws up about identity and fairness and justice and sharing and all those things that go to make up human communities. It's important we know about this stuff. It's important we don't forget things like the Holocaust. It's important for the reason that if we allow narratives to develop without moderation by historians and archaeologists, people will get it wrong, either accidentally or worse, deliberately. People will be familiar with the term Holocaust denial.
Yeah.
One of the things that archaeology at places like Sobibor and Treblinka has done is show that, it happened. Hundreds of thousands of people were murdered at those locations, as well as at Auschwitz-Birkenau. And the things that drove those mass murders are still in play today. Now, I mentioned Richard Wright, who'd done the work in Ukraine in the early 1990s for the government of South Australia for those war crimes trials. He went on to work for something called the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which investigated the mass murder of mostly Bosnian Muslims by the armed forces of Republika Srpska and Serbia in the 1990s during the civil war in former Yugoslavia, or civil wars in former Yugoslavia. And again, we've linked to an article which looks at the work of the international team of archaeologists, forensic anthropologists, morticians, and so on, who worked on the mass graves that were found in Bosnia, particularly related to the capture of Srebrenica. In 1992, 1993, that work resulted in the two leading perpetrators in the government of Serbia, Republika Srpska at the time, the political leader and the military leader being brought to trial. And it's no recompense for the families who still grieve the people who were murdered, but at least archaeologists help bring about justice. And I think that's something to be proud of as a profession.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Andy, for your time today. Thank you guys at home for watching. Please do comment below if you have any thoughts or questions or anything that you want to elaborate on, with the aforementioned caveat that unwelcome comments will be immediately deleted on this video. Of course, we're not going to be monetizing this video, and I haven't included, or won't have included, the customary Patreon ad in the middle either, out of respect. So just be aware of that as well. Thank you. Until next time, do take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.